The age of explorations in Europe led to two developments: the colonial expansion and an increase in international trade.
Discovery of these new trade routes along with this influx of bullion into Europe determined the nature of trade, economy and business methods, and also determined the subsequent enterprises that the Europeans would go on to pursue. Where trade is concerned, the most important changes that occurred was, now you have inter-regional trade, transoceanic trade, or the maritime trade if you can call it, the growth of markets. So there was the growth of markets which was actually dependent on the goods from all over the world.
The phenomenal growth in international trade led to a paradigm shift in the world of commerce. Financial institutions like banks and instruments such as currency notes became popular.
We have, along with this, the efflorescence of new kinds of commercial organizations. And this development of international trade, along with the urban development, as well as developments in banking and exchange between the period 1550 and 1700, especially in Holland and England, is called the Commercial Revolution. Let's say it this way: because of these geographical explorations, we have the evolution of what came to be known as the Atlantic economy.
And the hub of trade and commerce shifted from Italy to the western coast of Europe.
So Venice is losing out in its commercial importance to places like Lisbon, first to places like, say, Seville, places like Lisbon, and eventually to Antwerp and Amsterdam. That is, Amsterdam, you know, is the capital of Holland. Now, we find that the entrepot for spices also changes by the time you come to the 16th century, from Venice to Lisbon. So the whole economic epicenter of Europe changes from the Italian city-states to the ports of the Atlantic coast. Now, this also resulted, this shift in the focus, the economic focus in Europe, also resulted in changes in the types of commerce and the shift in trade. Now, we find that the products also now was not only, say, spices. The products from the East, there was now a growing variety in it. You have indigo becoming a very important product. You have porcelain from China, silk from China, cotton textiles from India, and of course you have tea, coffee, cocoa. Or the cocoa, of course, comes from the Americas. You have tea and coffee coming both from the Far East and the Near East. So new products now became important. Where trade was concerned, it was not only trade in corn and spices and wool and slaves. It now became, or the gamut, or the whole commodities, new commodities were were becoming important. And this, because of the European explorations, first into Africa, Asia and eventually the Americas, we find that European manufactured goods would now find a market in these new areas. This provided a kind of a stimulus to industry in Europe, which again, because the manufactured goods could be sold in these newly acquired territories, it meant an immense amount of profit, and this profit in its turn generated greater investment. We find new industries gaining importance: refining of sugar, the preparation of tobacco. These were new industries which were emerging in Europe. What is important to remember is this, that with the expansion of towns, with the proliferation of urban centers, we find that the money economy was becoming all-pervasive. Not only in the urban areas, but also in the countryside. New financial instruments were being introduced. But you must remember that so long exchange in the countryside was mainly on the basis of barter. Initially, both barter and the new instruments, financial instruments, coexisted with one another. And eventually, you know that the financial instruments, the new financial instruments, became much more important.
Paradoxically, with the growth of the new urban centers, agriculture attained renewed importance because more and more surplus food had to be produced for the urban population. So, improved techniques were deployed on the plots of land to improve their yield. And land on the new colonies were also utilized to grow new crops like sugarcane and corn.
Not only was agriculture becoming important, you find various rural industries also becoming important because of the commercial revolution. And this whole new era of the commercial revolution, or this whole new period, in fact, in its turn, provided a tremendous stimulus to capitalism. Now, there was this influx of precious metals both from Africa and the Americas. Along with this, we find that the coins that were already in circulation in Europe, that is, the coins minted out of the silver that was already available in Europe, the melting of plates. So this resulted in the influx of a huge amount of precious metals. And the precious metals meant capital, and this capital could be invested in various fields as you desired. But what is important to remember about the commercial revolution is this, that the new financial instruments that we were talking about were actually something which was not new. These were not new innovations, or these were not innovations. These were actually a refinement of the existing financial instruments, the financial instruments that existed in the various Italian city-states. When Italy was the hub, the economic hub of Europe, you find banking, credit systems, you find various promissory notes, you find various assignments, everything existing in those areas. So the Genoese and the Venetian financial classes had actually a very good knowledge about these things. They, when the economic center shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, they also shifted base. So the first banks were the ones which were promoted by these this emigre population who had now come and settled down in the various ports cities or the urban centers of the Atlantic.
Many of the early banks dealt primarily in coins and bullion, much of their business being money changing, and the supplying of foreign and domestic coins of the correct weight and fitness.
Now, what was important was that with the growth in commerce, it was not, or because of the growth of commerce, we find that international payments could not be unilateral. It had to be a multilateral clearing, where clearing would be not only confined to one place but many places, because there is an expansion of commerce. Not only is there an expansion of commerce, there is an expansion of the trade routes also.
These merchant bankers dealt both in goods and in bills of exchange, providing for remittance of money, settlement of accounts at a distance without shipping actual coin. Their business arose from the fact that many of these merchants held assets at different points along the trade routes.
Now, credit was granted. Credit was granted to the consumers first, and of course later also to the various enterprises. And how and what kind was credit granted? Credit was granted either in the form of oral agreements or in the form of a formal document which was called an IOU. IOU. Assignment was again something which had persisted in the economy of Europe. But now we find that it's getting a new form during this time. It was used in the form of promissory notes. These promissory notes eventually formed the banknotes. So, in due course of time, we find that paper currency comes into circulation. Whenever you want to finance a particular enterprise or finance a particular commercial venture, you do not have to carry bulky gold and silver from one place to another. You have these paper assignments, you have these paper currency, you have these agreements on paper. And the other thing is, if you accept the currency, money, the currency of various countries or various places, you have to actually take into consideration or make an assessment of the value of that money produced in the various mints of the world, whether they are produced in approved or legal mints, or they are produced in counterfeit mints. So the value of that currency would also have to be assessed. Because of this huge amount of, the circulation of these financial instruments, the intensification of the system of credit, you find that the use of money in the economy was accelerated. And this led to a creation of immense capital, which eventually would lead to the investment in industries and which eventually would lead to the industrial revolution of the 18th century, the first the industrial revolution in England, and of course later on it spread to the whole of mainland Europe.
By the 17th century, English bankers had begun to develop a deposit banking business. It was found that when money was deposited by a number of people, a fund of deposits came to be maintained at a fairly steady level. This fund of idle cash could be lent out at interest to other parties.
What is again very important regarding the commercial revolution is this, that previously you would have these fairs, you would have the occasional money markets, etc., etc., which were important. Now the money markets were, and these were temporary structures, these were all, transient structures. Now the money market was concentrated in the urban centers. The best example is Antwerp. Antwerp became the hub of the commercial activities in the Atlantic. You have the bourses, the transactions being carried out in the bourses, the stock exchanges coming up. You have the public banks coming up, first in Amsterdam, later in England. You have the banks now getting transformed into just banks not only giving credit but also accepting deposits. Previously, the banks were all, they were the banks which were promoted by private individuals or families or something of that sort. In due course of time, they became public banks, banks promoted by the government, where Bank of England is a very great example of this.
ম্যাম, পরবর্তীকালে তাহলে অ্যান্টওয়ার্পের ইম্পর্টেন্সটা ধীরে ধীরে কমে যাচ্ছে কেন?
Amsterdam now becomes the hub of the economic activity. It replaces Antwerp because of the revolt that Netherlands faced during this time. You see that one aspect of the commercial revolution was this, that it not only affected the economy, because in history, one event cannot just sort of have an impact on only one particular aspect. The effects that the commercial revolution had on the economy of Europe was bound to have a social impact also. Because now you find that the discrepancies in income that were there was further accelerated, where you have there a greater discrepancy in the incomes of the people.
There was a boom in the import of bullion after the discovery of the rich silver mines in Bolivia and Mexico, and new methods of extracting silver through the use of mercury were invented. During this period, some 18,000 tons of silver was added to Europe's monetary stock. Of the total, 1/5 was taken by the Spanish crown, some circulated in Spanish America. The rest was transported twice a year to Seville, from where it was distributed throughout Spain and ultimately throughout Europe.
You will find that as the population of Europe grows, wages fall. There is one class of people who have, especially the commercial classes, the merchant class, who have a lot of money at hand. They are the ones who actually henceforth will decide the destiny of Europe. They are the ones who are going to influence empires, who are going to influence princes, who are going to influence governments. And the wage earners are the worst sufferers, or their position becomes worse because you see that their actual money that they have at hand is decreasing because of the rise of population and various other associated factors.
Recent research suggests that the most important change that made it possible for this increased supply of bullion to infiltrate the economy and drive up prices was a general increase in population associated with growing demands, larger capital investments, and larger national incomes.
ম্যাম এই সময় কি কৃষি থেকে একটা সংখ্যক মানুষের শহরাঞ্চলে চলে আসা প্রবণতা দেখা দিচ্ছে?
Especially in England. In England, this is something which England witnesses, that the excess or the surplus labor is going into industry. Not in all places. If you look at the case of France, or if you look at Germany, in fact, not all European powers were actually progressive enough to enclose land or to introduce scientific methods of cultivation on land. That is why England probably had the first industrial revolution, because this enclosure of land, the introduction of new scientific mechanisms into agriculture resulted in the agricultural revolution, which again resulted in the accumulation of capital, which again resulted in the investment of this capital into industry. This did not happen either in France or in Germany or in any other country of mainland Europe.
সেক্ষেত্রে কি ওই দেশগুলোর নিজস্ব কিছু পশ্চাৎপদ দায়ী ছিল?
Every country, if you look at the economy of Europe in the 16th and the 17th centuries, then you will see there's certain similarities. But these similarities did not result in similar experiences in the various European countries. Why? Because you cannot forego the role of custom in history. So the destiny of each region in Europe was governed by the customs of that particular area. That is why we find variations in the European economy, though the transition should have been the same from feudalism into capitalism. That did not happen, because they were the regional issues which actually governed the history of the particular places.
আমি যে 1870-এর পর থেকে আমরা যে ঔপনিবেশিকতার একটা যুগ শুরু হচ্ছে, সেটা সূত্র কি আমরা এই কমার্শিয়াল রেভলিউশন থেকেই বলতে পারি?
Everything is so interlinked. In fact, the commercial revolution can be linked with the period of discovery and exploration. The period of discovery and exploration opened new avenues, resulted in the accumulation of capital, which was invested into commerce. This again generated further greater capital, which was invested into industry. A time comes when the land of Europe is no longer capable of sustaining the population of Europe. Then there is this quest to discover new areas and settle in those new areas. And eventually, when the industrial revolution does occur in Europe, there will be this greater impetus to sell these manufactured goods into areas other than Europe, because in Europe all countries were having the industrial revolution. So no countries would accept the industrial goods of another country. So where do you dispose of these goods? The best option would be to have a market under your control. And what better way to do it than acquire a colony for yourself?
When the great colonial powers of Europe founded their empires from the 16th century onwards, they attempted to monopolize trade with their colonies and turn it to their own profit. Their policy involved 4 main restrictions. The colonies were to trade exclusively with the mother country. They were not to undertake manufacturing, that is, transformation of raw material into finished goods. Imports and exports were to be carried out only in ships flying the mother country's flag. The mother country was to exempt colonies from trade duties or to impose lower rates.
এই ঔপনিবেশিক প্রতিদ্বন্দ্বিতার ফলে কিছু প্রধান রাষ্ট্র তারা প্রধান ভূমিকা পালন করছে, কিন্তু ইউরোপের অন্যান্য যে ক্ষুদ্র ক্ষুদ্র রাষ্ট্র তারা এই কমার্শিয়াল রেভলিউশনের ফলে ততটা যদি অগ্রগতি লাভ না করতে পারে তাহলে তারা পিছিয়ে পড়ছে। ফলে দুটো ভাগ এসে গেছে, একটা শক্তিশালী রাষ্ট্র ইউরোপের, আর একটা হচ্ছে ক্ষুদ্র ক্ষুদ্র কিছু তাদের তাবেদার গোষ্ঠী। তো ইউরোপের যে প্রথম বিশ্বযুদ্ধের সময় যে ভাগটা, তাহলে এই কমার্শিয়াল রেভলিউশন থেকে ভাগটা মানে বিভক্তিকরণটা শুরু হচ্ছে।
Naturally, those powers that are enriched by the colonial experience would obviously, because of their better position as far as the economics is concerned, they would be in a position to dictate terms. And the smaller states in Europe, if you see that the whole course of what is early modern and modern history, right down to the Second World War, if you can take it that way, then you will see it is actually the smaller states having to obey or abide by the dictates of these powerful nations. This all comes from who started the exploration and who eventually could control the major share of the colonial empire. So the fact that England played such a pivotal role in European politics and later world politics was because England commanded such a great empire. So when you talk about the commercial revolution is a revolution whereby you find new trade routes opening up, whereby you find new commodities entering into the trading arena, where you find the accumulation of capital, where you find the investment of capital into commerce as well as industry. But this also results in a growing pauperization of the population. A section of the population is also results in discrimination, a further discrimination. The social impact of this is that the European society becomes all the more stratified based on economics.
এই যে আর্থিক পরিবর্তনটা, এখান থেকে কোন রাজনৈতিক পরিবর্তনের সূত্র পাওয়া যায়?
Naturally, if there is this kind of discrepancy between the incomes of people, there is going to be a section of the have-nots who will always harbor the desire to revolt. So within the seeds of capitalism, maybe we see, or within capitalism, we see the seeds of socialism, sort of embedded in it, which will eventually result in the working class demanding certain rights of their own. Not only the working class in the industry, but also the peasantry.